Chapter 32. The night air was thick with tension as Pugsley led the charge to protect Nevermore Academy, the Nightshade Society trailing behind him. The group was small, but formidable. Xavier, Bianca, Yoko, and Ajax were all at his side, their faces grim with determination. Pugsley had one goal in mind: protect the academy. It was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Xavier, a tall and sharp-eyed member of the Nightshade Society, had his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to make sure we flank them," he muttered, his voice steady as he motioned toward the main entrance. "They'll come in through the front, but if we can catch them on the sides." Before he could finish, Pugsley raised a hand, cutting him off. His voice rang out with authority. "Werewolves, attack!" The werewolf students of Nevermore, including Eden, who had just experienced the transformation for the first time, howled and lunged toward Tyler, their forms shifting as the air around them grew thick with power. Eden's transformation was the most dramatic, her eyes turning amber, fur sprouting along her skin, her muscles contorting as she let out a bone-chilling growl. This was her first change, and it wasn't easy. Her claws scraped against the marble floor as she leapt at the Hyde, teeth bared. The Hyde roared, the beast within Tyler snapping and snarling as the pack of werewolves descended upon him. Eden, shaking and struggling to control the wolf inside her, managed to land a blow on the Hyde, forcing him back with an angry snarl. But the Hyde was no mere beast. Tyler, under the creature's hold, was stronger than anyone had expected, his strength fueled by the rage and desperation of the transformation. Inside the school, chaos erupted as Pugsley raced ahead, pushing through the students who had gathered to protect their home. He was a blur of motion, weaving through the halls as he made his way to where Tyler, no, the Hyde, was wreaking havoc. "We've got to stop him before it's too late," Pugsley shouted, his voice laced with panic. Meanwhile, in the heart of Nevermore Academy, the showdown between Wednesday and Crackstone was unfolding. The auditorium had become a battlefield, the space between the stage and the quad now consumed by the flames of an ancient curse. Crackstone, now fully resurrected, stood in the center, his form burning with an eerie, unnatural glow. The heat was unbearable, but Wednesday, her blood pulsing with determination, stood tall. Her eyes never left Crackstone's as she stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp. "This ends now." With one swift motion, Wednesday reached into the depths of her power, the very essence of her being, and struck. Crackstone's heart gave one last, painful beat before he exploded into flames, his figure disintegrating into ash. The room was silent for a moment, save for the crackling of embers. But just as victory seemed certain, Laurel Thornhill, recovering from the attack, walked forward, a cruel smirk on her face. She raised a gun toward Wednesday, her hand steady, despite the chaos. "You think you've won? You haven't seen the end of this yet," she sneered. Before Laurel could pull the trigger, a buzzing swarm of bees descended upon her. Ajax and Eugene, both quick and determined, ran up to Wednesday's side. Eugene, wide-eyed but resolute, grabbed her arm. "Are you okay?" "Where were you?" he asked, voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," Wednesday replied tersely, but her gaze remained fixed on Laurel, who was now on the ground, surrounded by the furious swarm. "I've got it covered," Eugene said, his usual chipper demeanor replaced by urgency. "Pugsley and the others are inside, fighting the monster. We need to go now." But Wednesday wasn't ready to leave just yet. "Not yet," she said, her voice commanding. "Ajax, turn Miss Thornhill to stone. She can't hurt anyone else." Ajax nodded, stepping forward with a grim determination. With a single gaze, he petrified Laurel, the transformation quick and final. The last trace of threat was gone, at least for now. "Eugene, stay here," Wednesday ordered. "Keep an eye on her. If she wakes up, I don't want her causing any trouble." Eugene gave a quick salute. "Got it," he said, staying behind as Ajax and Wednesday made their way inside. The Hyde, meanwhile, had become a formidable monster, his form grotesque and towering. His eyes were like endless pits of darkness, and his long, clawed fingers twitched with menace. But when he faced Wednesday, something strange happened. The werewolves and vampires, who had been relentlessly attacking him, suddenly stopped. The moment Wednesday's voice rang out, the Hyde seemed to hesitate, his monstrous gaze snapping toward her. "Tyler, stop!" Wednesday shouted, her voice sharp and clear. The wolves and vampires backed away at the sound of her command, their animal instincts allowing them to hear the subtle change in her tone. Tyler's human side was still there, buried under layers of fury and rage. The Hyde snarled, but its movements slowed. Wednesday took a few steps forward, her eyes locking with the monster's. Despite its terrifying form, she didn't flinch. She reached out a steady hand and touched the Hyde's rough, scaly face. The transformation started slowly at first. The Hyde's monstrous form seemed to shrink, his sharp claws retracting, his twisted back straightening. The heat of the battle started to dissipate, and the creature began to melt away, its form returning to the broken, exhausted Tyler. Tyler collapsed into her arms, his face buried against her chest as he sobbed, the weight of the transformation too much for him to bear. "I thought you were gone," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Wednesday wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, her own tears threatening to break free as she whispered back, "I'm here, Tyler. I'm here." At that moment, Thing, the death-embodied, sentient hand, appeared, moving swiftly to Principal Weems, who had been standing guard. The hand grabbed her jacket and tossed it toward Wednesday, who gave a quiet, grateful thank you as she draped the overcoat over Tyler's trembling form. Adele and the USSSPPO team, along with Sheriff Galvin, arrived at the scene just as the chaos began to settle. Officers quickly started counting students and teachers, making sure everyone was accounted for. No one had been hurt, and though the damage was extensive, the academy would survive. Tyler, still in Wednesday's arms, looked up at her, his face a mix of relief and guilt. "I couldn't control it. You don't have to explain," Wednesday interrupted softly. "We're okay now." As the sirens of the authorities echoed in the distance, Tyler finally relaxed, his tears slowing as he found solace in her embrace. It was over. The battle was won, and for now, they were safe. But deep down, Wednesday knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more battles ahead. More challenges. But with Tyler by her side, she knew they would face them all, together. The chill of the night was still lingering in the air, but the oppressive sense of danger that had gripped the forest was finally starting to lift. The courtyard of Nevermore Academy had transformed into an eerie calm, broken only by the steady hum of USSPPO agents and the distant sirens of local law enforcement. Sheriff Galvin stood near the center, his eyes scanning the scene, his thoughts a mix of confusion, guilt, and a newfound realization. Nearby, officers were interviewing the teachers and students, each of them still processing the chaos that had unfolded. Some spoke in hushed tones, others more loudly, recounting the terrifying moments when Laurel Thornhill had summoned Crackstone and attempted to manipulate the powers of the outcasts. The officers of the USSPPO stood by, their expressions stoic as they filed away notes, their familiarity with the supernatural world evident in the way they moved. But Sheriff Galvin wasn't paying much attention to the interviews. He had his eyes fixed on his son. Tyler, wrapped in a long trench coat, his face covered in blood and streaked with dirt, was being supported by none other than Wednesday Addams. Despite the fact that she was much smaller than him, she held him up with quiet strength, as though she had done this countless times before. Tyler's gaze met his father's, and for the briefest of moments, Sheriff Galvin saw something in his son's eyes. It wasn't the fear or defiance he had expected. No, it was acceptance. Tyler's dual nature was undeniable now. He was both human and Hyde, an outcast in a world that would never fully understand him. Sheriff Galvin's heart sank. Tyler is one of them. The words echoed in his mind, a heavy realization that he couldn't escape. For years, he had held on to the belief that his son could somehow be different, that maybe Tyler's troubled past was just a phase. But now, with the Hyde standing before him, it was clear that Tyler was not just different. He was one of the outcasts, just like his late mother. As Sheriff Galvin stood there, rooted to the spot, the sound of footsteps broke his trance. It was Adele, rushing toward her younger cousins, with an expression of pure relief on her face. "Wednesday, Pugsley," Adele called out, her voice carrying a mix of joy and concern. "Adele," Pugsley shouted, throwing his arms around her in a tight hug. Wednesday, though more composed than the rest, couldn't help but give a small, relieved smile as she wrapped her arm around her cousin. "I'm fine, Adele," she said softly, brushing off the concern, but there was a glimmer of warmth in her eyes. "Thank you." Adele's gaze softened as she reached out to Tyler, who stood with Wednesday, still recovering from the intense ordeal. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "Tyler, I'm so glad you're okay," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Tyler, his face still partially hidden, nodded slowly. He was no longer the same person she had known before. The Hyde had taken its toll, leaving behind a fragile sense of normalcy. Yet, Adele's hug grounded him, reminding him of the world he had fought for, and the people who would never let him go. But as Adele held him, Sheriff Galvin stood a few paces away, his eyes narrowing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He could see the way his son had changed, the way he clung to these outcasts as though they were his true family. Tyler didn't need his approval. He had made his choice. And yet, the sheriff stood there, a man torn. Could he accept that his son was now part of this world? Could he accept the outcast in his own flesh and blood? He couldn't bring himself to cross the distance between them. Not yet. Meanwhile, a team of USSPPO agents carefully approached Miss Thornhill's petrified form, her stone-like body being placed into a secure transport van. The eerie quiet of the courtyard was interrupted by the heavy thud of the van doors closing, locking her away in the tight, metal confines of the transport vehicle. "Adele," one of the agents said quietly as he passed by, his face hardened by years of clandestine operations. "We'll take it from here. We've got her contained." Adele, glancing at the van, nodded. "Good. Make sure she stays that way." The next morning, the atmosphere at Nevermore Academy was tense, but strangely subdued. The courtyard, once an eerie battleground of magic and mayhem, now felt like a heavy silence was settling in. USSPPO agents moved about efficiently, keeping watch and ensuring everything was in order as local law enforcement wrapped up their final tasks. Adele stood near the entrance to the courtyard, keeping a close eye on her younger cousins as they went through their interviews. She had already warned them, "Just tell them what you know. They won't bite." And while the kids were nervous, she had no doubt they'd manage just fine. As she scanned the area, the figure of Jerry James, the director of the USSPPO, caught her attention. His tall frame cut through the crowd with purpose, and the way he moved seemed to carry the weight of the moment. With a crisp motion, he snapped his fingers twice, two short, sharp clicks that resonated across the courtyard. It was a signal. The secret code for the Nightshade Society. Instantly, Bianca, Xavier, Ajax, Yoko, Eden, and a few other students turned toward the sound. Their eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the familiar gesture. Jerry's gaze was focused on them now, his expression unreadable, but his eyes twinkled with an unspoken message. "Come on, kids. I won't bite. Just want to ask you a few questions," he called out, his voice carrying above the soft murmur of the gathered agents. Without hesitation, the group of Nightshade students moved toward him, curiosity, and perhaps a little caution, etched on their faces. Bianca was the first to speak, her tone sharp but not unfriendly. "What's going on? What is this really about?" Jerry smiled. "We'll get to that. Just follow me." He led them toward a quiet area where a set of interrogation rooms had been set up. The kids were ushered into separate rooms, one by one, while Adele lingered outside, ensuring everything went smoothly. The process was methodical, but as the first student, Bianca Barkley, entered the small, sterile room, she couldn't help but break the silence. "How come I've never heard of you guys before?" she asked, her voice full of a mixture of genuine curiosity and skepticism. Jerry leaned back in his chair, clearly prepared for this question. He smiled and replied, "We're a secret government agency." Bianca raised an eyebrow. A secret government agency? Sounds official. Ajax, who had been waiting just outside, overheard the exchange as he was brought in next. The United States Secret Program for Protecting Outcasts, huh? Sounds dope, he grinned, clearly intrigued by the implications of it all. Yeah, well, I guess you could say it's pretty official, Jerry said, allowing himself a small chuckle. Xavier entered next, his eyes immediately landing on Jerry with a probing look. Why'd you pick us? He asked. What makes us special? Because you're Nightshade kids, Jerry replied, matter-of-factly. Wait a minute, Ajax cut in, overhearing. So every Nightshade kid can join you guys? His smile grew wider, clearly thrilled by the idea of being part of something bigger. Jerry chuckled softly, shaking his head. Not exactly. But you all have a unique set of skills. And that's important. As the interviews continued, Jerry's demeanor remained calm and collected, while the students seemed more at ease, their curiosity spilling over. I need you to collaborate on something, Jerry said, leaning forward slightly, his expression serious. Did Miss Thornhill ever seem off to any of you? Bianca didn't even hesitate. She laughed lightly, but her eyes were serious. Are you kidding me? She was suspicious from the start. She was obviously playing some kind of game, Ajax chimed in, leaning back in his seat with a knowing smirk. It was clear from the beginning. Yoko, sitting across from Jerry, nodded in agreement. I totally saw her try to act all concerned and caring toward Tyler, while clearly being manipulative. And trust me, I wasn't the only one who saw that. When Wednesday walked in and saw Miss Thornhill touching Tyler's hand, that was when it all clicked. Yeah, she was trying to get between them from the start, Eden added, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was super obvious. Jerry's brow furrowed slightly. So you all knew something was off with her? Even before the whole Crackstone thing? Yeah, Bianca said, her tone sharp. You could just tell. There was something about her that didn't sit right. The room was quiet for a moment before Jerry continued, his voice taking on a more probing edge. Did you know that Wednesday's boyfriend, Tyler, was a Hyde? The question hung in the air for a few seconds, and then Xavier, ever the quick-witted one, answered. Yeah, we should have expected that. Now it all makes sense, Bianca added, her expression one of realization. Wait, hold up. Wednesday's dating a serial killer? Ajax laughed, his voice full of both surprise and amusement. I guess that makes sense. The Addams family is weird in the best way possible. Yeah, and we were all kind of thrown off at first, Yoko chimed in, I mean, Wednesday dating a normie? Please. But this? Yeah, I can see that. It's so on brand for her. Eden, ever the one to make light of a situation, giggled slightly. I mean, it's Wednesday. Dating a serial killer monster? Yep, that checks out. Jerry, who had interviewed the Nightshades one by one, separately raised eyebrow, shook his head slightly. Looks like she's just as weird as her cousin, he muttered with a chuckle of his own, before turning his attention back to his notes. The conversation shifted, and the interviews moved on. But Jerry couldn't help but appreciate how the kids had pieced everything together so quickly. Despite the chaos and the danger they had faced, they seemed to have a better grasp on this situation than even some of the more seasoned agents. As each student was led out of the interrogation rooms, Jerry's mind wandered for a moment, taking in the complexity of the situation. This was bigger than just the resurrection of Crackstone or Miss Thornhill's machinations. This was about the future of outcasts, and the part these kids, these Nightshade kids, would play in that future. The answers they'd provided were just the beginning. Now, it was time for the real work to begin. The atmosphere in the interrogation rooms was far more intense than when the students were questioned. Jerry James didn't hold back when it came to the teachers. His questions were sharp, his tone biting, and he made sure to push the boundaries, testing their defenses with every word. Principal Weems sat across from him in the cold, sterile room, trying her best to maintain an air of authority, despite the weight of Jerry's piercing gaze. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, clearly not in the mood for pleasantries. Why did you hire Miss Thornhill, or Laura Gates, as she goes by now? Jerry asked, his voice dismissive. Didn't it seem odd that a normie would want to teach at an outcast school? I looked at her resume, it's solid, no doubt. But why would she want to be in a hostile work environment, with the staff being mostly supernatural beings? Did you ever ask yourselves that? He let the question hang in the air, giving her no room to dodge it. Weems shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Well, the board insisted it would send a good message, she explained, clearly trying to justify herself. A message of inclusivity, showing that we accept normies alongside outcasts. It was meant to showcase diversity and openness. Coach Vlad, speaking from the adjacent room, echoed the sentiment. Yeah, the board thought it'd be a step forward, you know? Show the world that we're not just some isolated school for supernatural kids. They wanted to show that everyone could be part of this world. Jerry, already growing tired of the answers, slammed his hand down on the table in frustration. That didn't work out so well, did it? His voice was cold, blunt. Adele called me several times for updates on my investigation into Miss Thornhill. I know Adele. If she found Thornhill suspicious, she'd have been breathing down your neck, demanding answers. Did you take her advice at all? Maybe consider laying off or even firing her? Weems hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. We considered it, but... No, Jerry cut her off sharply, leaning in closer. You didn't. I talked to the students, they found Thornhill suspicious. So tell me, what exactly were the adults doing while all of this was happening? There was an uncomfortable silence. Jerry's words hung in the air like a threat. Wednesday Addams, a 16-year-old girl, took down Crackstone, Jerry continued, his voice biting. And what were you doing, Principal? You couldn't protect your students. They had to handle it themselves. The werewolves and vampires fought off the Hyde, and your best plan was, what? Nothing? Weems opened her mouth to speak, but Jerry was on a roll, not giving her a chance. How about Thornhill's obsession with Wednesday and Tyler? Did you ever stop to think that was strange? The students found it odd. Hell, Adele thought Thornhill was a pedophile at first. Did none of that set off any alarms for you? I get it. She was your hire, your responsibility. But did you seriously ignore every red flag that was staring you in the face? Weems' face flushed, but she remained silent, clearly rattled by Jerry's directness. Coach Vlad was the next target. Jerry's voice was laced with frustration as he spoke. You were supposed to be a protector here, a coach, but where were you when things went south? Did you honestly think hiring a normie would be progressive when the students are literally fighting for their lives against a resurrected monster? Vlad clenched his jaw, but didn't reply immediately. Jerry's scathing remarks had clearly taken a toll, but Vlad wasn't the type to break easily. I get it, okay? Vlad finally muttered, his voice low and gruff. We didn't know what we were dealing with. She was new, and we were trying to keep the peace. Trying to keep the peace? Jerry repeated, incredulous. While the students were being manipulated, while a damn Hyde was stalking them? This is what you're telling me? You couldn't see what was right in front of your face? Vlad shifted uncomfortably. We were blindsided, all right? She seemed normal at first. It wasn't until after Crackstone that everything started to fall apart. Normal? Jerry's voice grew colder. You hired a normie without considering the obvious consequences. And you let her weave her web of manipulation while your students were fighting for their lives. You failed them. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Back to Principal Weems, clearly rattled, was trying to compose herself. Look, Jerry, we didn't have all the information. Thornhill, she played the role well. We had no reason to believe. I'm sure you didn't, Jerry interrupted with a sneer. No reason to believe a normie was hiding a dark agenda while your students were the ones cleaning up your mess. You didn't protect them. Hell, they had to protect you in the end. A 16-year-old girl saved the day while the rest of you stood around looking clueless. Weems clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Jerry's words were clearly hitting her harder than she wanted to admit. He didn't stop. And don't get me started on her fixation with Tyler and Wednesday. Even the students noticed it. Why didn't you? It's not as simple as you think, Weems stammered, trying to regain control of the conversation. Jerry shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. You hired a normie who had no business being here, and you ignored every warning sign. And now, because of your incompetence, your students are the ones cleaning up your mess. Wednesday had to stop Crackstone. The werewolves and vampires had to deal with the Hyde. And all you could do was watch. At that, Weems visibly winced, but the silence between them was deafening. Jerry leaned back in his chair, watching her, his eyes narrowing. I think it's time you realize, Principal Weems, this wasn't just about one teacher. This is about the failure of your leadership. You were supposed to protect these kids, not let them fend for themselves. And with that, Jerry stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he walked out of the room, leaving Weems to stew in the uncomfortable silence he had created. The truth of his words, harsh and direct, hung in the air. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Like, comment, and subscribe to be notified for updates on this series.